Okay, hi everyone. I'm Tara Sheehan, the Executive Director of APPAM, and I'm here to welcome you to our webinar, The Future of Public Service. Are the Kids All Right? This is the third in a series of webinars that APPAM has featured covering recent changes in the federal government. All the recordings for our webinars can be found on our website, and stay tuned for future events that explore topics like policy analysis under the Trump administration, tariffs, clean slate policies, and translating research for a diverse audience. Just a couple of housekeeping notes. Please add questions to the Q&A window as they come up, and we will leave a good amount of time at the end to try to get it to as many questions as we can. I'm going to introduce the panel in reverse order, panelists first and moderator last, as our esteemed moderator is doing a live interview with the BBC right now about Doge and should be joining us in a few minutes. So our first panelist is Dan Mallinson from Penn State Harrisburg. He is an associate professor of public policy and administration in the School of Public Affairs. Dan's an expert in state and local politics and policy. Additionally, he's interested in cannabis policy, energy policy, and the science of teaching and learning. He is also particularly interested in Pennsylvania state politics and has experience as an information specialist for the Pennsylvania Public Utility Commission and a program analyst for the Office of the Inspector General in Philadelphia. He has also published widely in many field journals. Thanks, Dan, for participating today.
Thank you.
Our next panelist is TJ McCarthy. TJ is a professor at the Sol Price School of Public Policy at the University of Southern California. His primary interests are in applied microeconomics, particularly labor, health, and public economics. His research within the field of economics has focused on the effects of education and military service on individuals' marital prospects and long-term health. And he has collaborated on interdisciplinary work with researchers at the UC Davis Medical Center and the Keck School of Medicine and the Children's Hospital of LA on a variety of topics ranging from breast cancer risk reduction to the use of antibiotics in treating children with ear infections. He is also a member of the APPAM Policy Council. Thank you, TJ, for taking part today. I appreciate it. And then finally, Kosali Simon, who is the Herman B. Wells Endowed Professor at Indiana University, and she is also the Paul O'Neill Chair, the Associate Vice Provost for Health Sciences, and an elected member of the National Academy of Medicine, and is the editor of the Journal of Health Economics. She's also the president-elect of APPAM. So this upcoming conference is Kosali's conference. She is a nationally known health economist who specializes in applying economic analysis in the context of health insurance and healthcare policy. Her current research mainly focuses on the impact of health insurance reform on healthcare and labor market outcomes, and on the causes and consequences of the opioid crisis. And thank you, Kosali, for being here today.
Excited to be here.
And finally, on to Don Kettl. So Don is a professor emeritus and former dean at School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland. He is also a non-resident senior fellow at the Partnership for Public Service, the Volcker Alliance, and the Brookings Institute. He's an author of several books. His most recent is The Politics of the Administrative Process, and he's won several prestigious awards, including the Lewis Brownlow Book Award of the National Academy of Public Administration for the best book published in public administration, which he won twice. Prior to being at Maryland, he taught at the University of Pennsylvania, Columbia University, UVA, Vanderbilt, and the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's a regular columnist for Governing Magazine and has consulted broadly for government organizations at every level. So when Don gets here, I will actually officially welcome him. So in short, this is an illustrious panel that hopefully will make us feel better about the state of things, I hope. So just to kick us off in general, you're all professors, you all teach PhD, master's level, undergraduate level students. What are you hearing from your students? How is everybody feeling? What's the general mood from your students about what's going on in the federal government? And anybody can jump in.
I can jump in to get started. I just finished teaching my undergraduate class, and I know that when I talk with undergraduate compared to master's, compared to PhD students, it's a very different setting of what I hear. So first and foremost, I think the PhD job market, we have definitely seen that there has been a shift in what it was like from the early part of the market. Some of the jobs, of course, in these markets, we see already at the APPAM conference. So in November itself, there are places that are actively interviewing, and it seemed back then that it seemed like a very much a different market than compared to people who are, let's say, still on the market completing towards now. And there it is really sending ripple effects also to the students who are getting ready to go onto the market in the following year, trying to anticipate, well, should I wait it out, or is it that this is actually likely a better market than the next year? So that's a topic I think we might get into, which is advising students who are on the margin saying, do I still keep looking, or do I want to go for next year? For master students, especially MPA students, it is a lot of figuring out where, even if it's first year, it's where the internships that might have been what we thought would be available, and then it's our places that look like they're doing a lot of downsizing. Where do we think about applying where these same skills might be useful someplace else? So that's a little bit of what I hear undergraduate students seem. My sense is the least affected, at least from what I can tell, only because their options might be much more. There may be, even with a public management degree, easier pathways, or looking at other non-governmental, non-state jobs, for example.
Yeah, I think in Kosley's point, even within those groups, I think a lot of the sentiment depends on where are they within their timelines. So for PhD students hitting the market now, their decisions are made, they're kind of locked in, and it's a matter of what's going to be sort of the next step for me, kind of out of my hands. Whereas those who are earlier in the program, I think there's more optimism that sort of by the time they actually complete the programs, there'll be at least some sort of return to normalcy. I think there the concern is more on the sort of visa side than the market side for the international students in particular. I also think, oddly, the master's students are in kind of an odd position in that for the undergrads, they're both sort of at a point where they have a lot of options in front of them, but they also have grad school as a way to sort of ride things out for a couple of years, to the extent they think that this is relatively short term, whereas those coming at the master's level, a shift from going into the workforce to jumping into, say, a PhD is a very different sort of a thing. And so I think they also have their hands tied to some extent in a similar way. And so I think that's the big divide is, who's hitting the market now and who's doing more long-term planning is where I think you get a lot of that split.
Yeah, that's fair. Hi, Don. How are
Hello
you?
there. Thanks so much for holding the fort, and a bit my apologies for joining you a little bit late, but this is just such an important conversation, and I'm so very, very glad that APPAM has organized this, and I'm looking forward to hearing what my colleagues, but especially if all the members of the audience have to say about this.
No, thank you. So I'll bring you up to speed, and then I'm gonna hand it over to you. So we did the introductions, and then we just what we're hearing from students. So I don't know, Dan, if you wanted to answer that, please feel free.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with the things that have been said. I mean, I'll also say that I think it also depends on which of the students that you're talking to. So we have a lot of international students in our doctoral program and in our undergraduate programs, and they're clearly very concerned. The international students that are on the market now, or that are looking at the market next year, a lot of them are wondering what is a hiring committee gonna think about in its pool when they're making those decisions. If it comes down to me and a student from the U.S., am I going to be sort of bumped out because of the visa concerns and sponsorship concerns? I mean, there's also I've been surprised at some of the ads. I have a student on the market now, and some of the ads that of institutions that said they won't sponsor, that I was surprised that they're not. And I have to imagine it's because of the current environment. So I think in particular, the international students are very concerned. And then, like a lot of the other large institutions, and I'm sure the small ones as well, we have students that are having their visas revoked and are having to process through that. So, it's quite a difficult environment for those students.
It's a tough time for sure. I've got, let me say to everyone that I've got at least a list of my top 5 things that at least people have to be optimistic about. That is the top 5 jobs that people might be able to think about so transporting themselves to. But before doing that, can I ask each of you to think about if you were to try to put a thermometer on all this and to try to judge the level of concern among the students on like a scale of 0 to 100, where would you be? And let me ask Kosali to start, if you would.
I think, especially given that there is there's such a variety of circumstances, I would say that for a substantial portion, it is a very high number. I don't know if I'd say, I don't know, certainly above 50. I'm not sure how high to put it, because there is still cautious optimism of maybe things will really change again fast, or maybe we don't know where, because the pace of change has been so rapid currently. There is, I think, a possibility of people saying, well, I don't want to make drastic changes because I just don't know what 2 months from now will look like, and maybe there are some things I'm not seeing. So I think that's part of the concern, is that it's not that we feel like we've reached an equilibrium where we do a lot of setting expectations of here's what this is like right now. So that's part of what causes, I think, concern to be high among students.
Yeah, I just before I turn to both TJ and Dan, it's worth reminding ourselves that we're only 3 months into this. I mean, only 3 months. I mean, Christmas and New Year's seem like about 500 light years away at this point. So that's just stunning stuff. TJ, what would, on your fever thermometer, where would you put it?
I'd say I think the top and bottom ends are both pretty well occupied, and there's not a whole lot in the middle, is my sense from students. I think you have a lot of folks who are very concerned and a lot of folks who are not, and not a whole lot of people who are moderately concerned. I think for a lot, the challenge is this standing out from a pretty high baseline level of chaos, of what it actually takes to register. It either sort of just fades in the background or it's a crisis in terms of how that's received. I also think there's just so much uncertainty, as you said, where it seems like we're farther into this than we actually are. And there's also such instability in terms of say follow through on these things that I think it's hard for people to be totally sure about what is an actual long-term change and what is just a temporary thing that might completely reverse short term. And so I think it's tough for people to make a read on that.
Yeah, that's a good point, TJ. And I want to come back to that point in just a second. Dan, your thought and the favorite thermometer?
Sure. Yeah, I agree with TJ's point about the sort of the bimodal nature of this. Like, I have students that, and I tend to hear the most from the students who are very concerned, of course, right? I mean, I do think there's a lot of students that are still, especially my undergraduate students, that are sort of still tracking along with their plans. The ones who are most concerned are those who were interested in federal service, and now they're seeing internship programs canceled and hiring frozen and things like that. But I think that the next wave that we're just starting to see here, because we're near the state capital of Harrisburg, a lot of our students are already interested in state government. And initially, and I know we're going to get to talk about this, but initially states like Pennsylvania saw an opportunity to hire federal workers. But now the funding cuts are starting to ripple down to the states and also out to nonprofits. And I'm seeing increased uncertainty and concern about students who, weren't interested in federal service. So fine, it's chaotic there. I'm not going there. I want to work for the state government or for a nonprofit, but are now starting to see those opportunities come into question. So yeah, it's just so much chaos and uncertainty for the students.
Yeah. And a couple points just out of curiosity I want to try to make, but let me say before doing that, and I'll repeat this a couple times, but to all of you who are listening, if you've got questions for in general, or for any of our panelists in particular, please don't hesitate to pop them into the chat box. And if you do that, there's Q&A at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So just where it says Q&A, just put your questions there and we will get to as many as we possibly can. But let me make a couple points, if I could, just from where I sit. I've been kicking around this business for a long time. And in fact, remember Watergate, remember all what was happening during the 1960s with the Great Society. I've been in this business for quite a while, and this is as big and traumatic a change in as short a period of time as certainly has happened in the course of my career, and I would wager probably in the life of this country. And so, if it seems like it's a kind of uncertain big deal, I think it's probably because it's an uncertain big deal. This is really, really big. But on the other hand, I think that that also means it's an opportunity for us to redefine what it is that we think ought to be done and how it ought to get done. And so I think there is, although it may seem kind of faint and hollow, that there is an opportunity here that, and I want to come back to that in a bit longer, a little bit further on down the road as well. But the other is, and one last point, you know, if we had it to do all over again and could go back to say January 1st of 2025, we probably wouldn't want to. We probably should, or if we wanted to, we probably shouldn't. There were a lot of problems and issues and challenges and pathologies baked into the system that we probably wouldn't want to go back to no matter what, even if we could. And we, of course, there'd be temptations for doing that. We'd really want to try to say, you know, make this all go away. But it's not only is it here, but we probably shouldn't go back to the way it was. And so the challenge that we've got now is trying to deal with what's right in front of our face on the one side, and on the other, trying to figure out how we position ourselves for the future at the same time as well. And so those are really big issues I think we have to face. And one thing that I want to ask is that the issue of foreign students has come up a couple of times, and I want to try to talk about that. It may be a question where we have maybe uncertain answers at best on this, but both from what you're seeing and from the experience that you've had in working with your students, what can we say about and to foreign students who are concerned about this?
I think something that has always been important, but is especially important, is to ensure that all the documentation, the I-20s, every piece of document that establishes the status is up to date, and that no room is left for this. There wasn't enough. If there are any processes that need to take place, plan on lots of advanced time. Don't wait even for the expedite. There, even when there are expedited options available at higher fees, sometimes, like I know is there for the H-1B, for example, just plan way in advance. So that's one. And the other is just, I think, staying in close contact with the university's international student office to make sure that you learn from every information outlet that is being used, a webinar they might organize, whether it's drop-in office hours, just take advantage of those, because the people who are in those positions might have some more update into information and advice that you want to make sure you get.
You know, and I've got a point in particular about making sure to give yourself as much time as you possibly can is really good advice, because just in general, lots of the information systems are just kind of screwed up right now. And there's just one tiny personal note as I was trying to check and see where my income tax refund was. And there's a handy little IRS tab where you can go and see where's my refund. And so click, and the site was down. And so they're just having even with all what's going on, and you've heard the stories about Social Security, some of the IT systems just are a little bit ragged right now. So all the more reason to give yourself plenty of time. Dan, I mean, sitting there in Harrisburg. Let me say I have to interrupt before going on, is that I grew up in the great city of York, just 20 miles to the south of you. So I am a huge fan of the program there, and of those in central Pennsylvania, and those of us who live there also know that it's the dividing line between the people who are Eagles fans on the one side and the Steelers fans on the other, and it's a terrific place to go and get a really good fight going. So, Dan,
Yeah, so and I
maybe,
grew up
maybe not
in
so much on that, but international students.
sure. I grew up in Lancaster, so I'm a Redbirds. Yeah. Take it another level. So yeah, I mean I agree with everything, especially for the undergraduate students. One thing that I've seen for our advanced doctoral students, because we have a lot of international students in our doctoral program here in public administration, it has been really valuable for them to connect with an immigration attorney, especially as they're approaching the job market, to know what their options are, to know what the process is, to make sure that everything is, all the ducks are in a row for them moving forward and also where they're at now. And I mean, I think that's a broader point also for all levels of international students, is to really educate yourself on the rules, on your rights, and also how to respond if you are contacted by an ICE agent, or in some of these situations that we're seeing. I think the students do have to well, educate themselves, but also, I mean, I do think it's incumbent on us to provide resources to help them be educated in this environment. So, and I've seen that in some places. I have a former student who's faculty out at University of California, Dominguez Hills, and they've run a panel for their students on, with an immigration advocate, on knowing your rights, knowing the process, things like that. So I think there's ways that we as institutions can help support our students and educate them.
Yeah, true. That's really helpful. TJ.
Yeah, I would just echo, there are offices at your institution that are equipped to answer these. I'd be really careful about going to non-specialists, say like us, to get specific advice beyond just directing you to those resources. And I'd be very careful about assumptions along the lines of, well, this seems like a reasonable sort of response here, or this seems a reasonable expectation. I think that reasonableness standard is not something you can necessarily rely on. So that due diligence of figuring out exactly what the rules are, exactly what you need, and being prepared, as Kosali mentioned, even to these things like having your documentation ready to go, that might not seem like something we would have expected to have to do. It's not a bad idea to be maybe a bit over prepared.
Yeah, and TJ, you're surely not suggesting that we shouldn't rely on social media for advice, are you?
Never.
And really, the moral of the story is that there really are people who know what they're doing, and there are a lot of people around who are there and interested in trying to help all of our students and all of us to try to navigate it. And so it's making sure that you touch base with the right people and not rely on word of mouth, and not rely on social media, and not rely uh, but say people like me who are very concerned about the situation, but could not possibly give you the right advice about exactly what to do. So I think that's good advice that we've heard, I think, so far. That we have lots and lots of really great questions coming through forward. And Lana Gadou says, I'm a current MPA student, and one of the things that Lana is talking about is maybe should I leave the country? Should I think about trying to create a career someplace else, maybe with a company that can position me abroad? Is living abroad even feasible? Is it a good idea? Is it? What do you think? And Kosali, let me ask you about that for starters.
It is, again, so hard to make decisions based on information that's been changing so rapidly when we're thinking about longer run decisions, right? So one possible way to think about it is we know that when we go into careers, we usually think about career lifetimes as being pretty long. So I think keeping a medium run, long run view in mind is useful. For example, thinking, even if I don't think the job market this year is going to get me the job that I thought I was aiming for to enter right away, I might want to think about what are alternative pathways of medium run, in which case, which will get me onto my long run trajectory. That is, will make me still keep gaining towards that. An example would be, if somebody thinks an academic career is what I really want long run, but short run, I might work in an organization that is not a university. Still keep thinking about how do I want to make sure that I keep networked with the career paths I want to head to. How do I make sure I keep thinking about publishing papers that will go into my CV, or trying to keep up with learning what is a life, what is the professional development path would have been, even if I am going to be in some places. But yeah, because these are just really short run periods of a very long run career. About the particular question about international employment versus US, I think again, I'm not in a good position to be able to answer that, because that's not what I might know the closest about, but it's a tough time. I just want to empathize with the question.
I guess I think the underlying the question as I read it in more detail, it's golly gee, it's just a thing so bad that I had to think about leaving the country and just try to do something somewhere else. My wife and I've sometimes joked. We have two dogs, and I know people in New Zealand, and should we think about becoming sheep farmers somewhere? It's just but what it has to do, I think, most fundamentally with is it still a fight worth fighting? And Dan, let me toss that to you.
I'm really glad you put it that way, because I think it's a broader point. The same question is coming up with students who are interested in a career in public service, but maybe are now questioning whether they should do that, whether that's worth it, whether they'll be respected, whether they'll be, appreciated, valued, and hired, of course. And I mean, I think this is the time where we, especially as a profession, have to double down on the importance of what we do, right? And certainly not walk away from it. But I mean, I do think that people have to be sober in evaluating the current environment, and I guess speak more specifically to the question of, should I leave? I mean, I would never encourage people to leave. I don't think we're at that place yet, certainly. But you may want to think about broadening your options and your horizons for that career that you're interested in, as Kosali mentioned. An international might not be something that you've thought about before, but it may be a broadening of your options is not a bad idea. I mean, one thing that keeps coming to mind as we talk about, are these short term, are these long term? I mean, we don't have snap elections in the US. So we have this administration for another 3 years and 9 months. It's only been 3 months. So, I mean, certain things will certainly snap back, either because of court decisions, or we're seeing the administration back down because of just a variety of things where they sort of turn around on decisions. So I'm sure we'll see more of that, but the antagonism against public servants is not going to go away, at least within this administration. So I do think people need to be sort of sober about that. But I think this is the time where we really need to elevate the importance of a effective professional government that serves the people.
TJ, this is such an important question. I want to get your views on this as well. I mean, I guess the basic question is it worth staying in the fight?
Yeah, and I'd say bigger picture, I'd be very leery about completely overturning your plans in response to something that I think we have so little certainty about how things actually go, that I'd be really cautious about taking any particular path that is only the right one under a very specific set of circumstances. I'd tend to try and go with something that, as I've mentioned, gives you options and helps move you toward what you're looking to do, regardless of how the details play out in the short term. And I think bigger picture, however much disruption there is now and however much things move around, I have a hard time seeing a future where there isn't any role for substantial public policy employment, where we don't actually have a need for competent civil servants, for well-trained public administrators and analysts. The government has functions. They're pretty essential in many ways. To have that just disappear, I think, is not a reasonable expectation. And I'd also say that this is a bit of an odd career path and that this is not, say, entirely mercenary, right? We don't tend to end up here because it's, well, where am I going to get the biggest paycheck? Like we actually believe in what we're trying to accomplish. And that's not entirely a substitute for wanting to be reasonably compensated and have good job prospects and things like that. But it's something that I would hope we wouldn't just casually abandon. I'm not going to say minimize this and say there's just minor headwinds or something trivial like that, but I would hope that it would take quite a lot for us to change course that dramatically. And I'd say remain optimistic that however far we go to medium run, long run, where that shifts, there's going to be a need for this work to be done. And I think there's going to be opportunities in that, even though I think clearly there's some transition pains in getting to whatever that future looks like.
Now, one of the questions I want to ask all of you, I'll warn you, but not for a little while, is okay, what should you do to try to train yourself? What kind of choices should you make about courses and expertise and how to try to prepare yourself? But before getting to that point, and just a warning to Dan, I've got a question from Logan here. I want to toss to you in just a second, but I think that at least two things I know about this stuff. One is that I used to talk to the senior feds, and I said, I tell my students often that half of the problems that all of you are going to be working on haven't even been invented yet 10 years from now. That the stuff 10 years from now you're going to be busying yourself with haven't even been invented. And the response I got back is, Don, you're enormously underestimating that. It's much more than that. That the really exciting part of our business is being able to gain the skills to deal with the stuff that is down the road and around the corner that we can't even quite see at this point. And with luck, one of the things we can contribute is some insight to that. But to flip it on the other side, one of the other things I told my students is that if you look back to ancient Rome, and if there were things that the ancient Romans did and things that they needed skill in when it came to public policy and public administration, and we're still doing it today, that's probably a pretty good bet for your future. And the other day, in fact, I came upon some research about a housing crisis that the Roman government had not fairly early in the 1st century AD, that I swear if you went and changed the names and changed the dates, and it would look exactly like what happened in 2008, 2009. So that there's insights we can bring, because some of the stuff, there's no way that we as a people, forget the government, we as a people are going to be able to run away from. So I think that that just ain't going to change as we get further on down the road. So that's one of the reasons why at the core, I'm in some ways really excited about what it is that we have, because we shouldn't go back. If we look way back, we know what it is that isn't going to go away. And if we look forward, we know that the one thing we need to prepare ourselves for is what hasn't been invented yet. And we think about that as a basic strategy. Who wouldn't be excited about that? I wouldn't want to run to another country to escape the possibility of having to engage those questions. And Lana, I know that you're concerned about this, but boy, do I hope that you're going to be here putting your shoulder to that wheel, because that we're going to need all the help we can get. So Dan, here's a question for you. MPA student, what role can those interested in a typically non-political role in professional management, like city management, have in advocating for effective public administration? So is there a role to perhaps to try to escape some of the political battles by thinking about becoming, for example, a city manager?
Oh, it's interesting. Yeah. I don't know that you can escape the political battles. Even non-political positions are operating in a political environment, right? Which I think any probably city manager has experienced. I'm looking at the question from Logan, and the thing that came to my mind is there is, I think, we do have to think about, and I wish I had a really good answer. Like I could say this is what we need to do, but I do think that in public administration, there's a lot of quiet excellence that occurs, right? So in my policy analysis class, we just talked about policy failure and learning from failure. But at the end of that class, I always sort of talk to students about, there's a lot of government that works. And I think one of the lessons that a lot of Americans are going to experience in the coming months is what happens when government stops working well. Don trying to check on his taxes and the system is down, right? People are going to get a lesson in things that just worked before, but we never talk about the things that work and work well. And that's where I get to the quiet excellence. We pay attention to the squeaky wheel and the things that don't work, the failures, etc. I mean, as we should, but I don't know yet how we most effectively advocate for ourselves, but I do think that this is a period where we kind of have to stand together and communicate our value to society. And I'm glad that they mentioned an organization like ICMA. I mean, I think professional organizations, this is a role that they need to play, like APPAM, like the American American Society for Public Administration, American Political Science Association. I think associations are going to have to be more active on behalf of those who are and more political themselves. I mean, I don't know. We're still operating in a political environment, so we have to think about how to navigate that. But so yeah.
That's a great response, Dan, because I think it really does point to some of the opportunities. But one of the things that I think I've also heard underlying Logan's question was, is there a way that we can insulate ourselves from all the political conflict and uncertainty by trying to look at a non-political side of the administrative street? And I'll tell you at least my answer to that is that, and part of this having grown up at the feet of scholars like Aaron Wildofsky and Ed Lindblom and others, is that the answer is absolutely positively no. That anything that really matters has to do with values, and all values have to do with politics, and all bits of politics have to do with disagreements. And so if you're going to limit yourself, 2 points on that. One is, if you're going to limit yourself to things that are either non-political or easy, you're not going to have a very satisfying career, because you're going to be dealing with dull and boring stuff. If you want to make a difference, you want to have some impact, you want to work on the stuff that matters, you're going to inevitably have to deal with stuff that has to do with politics, but politics in the sense of trying to figure out what the values are. And I was listening to Admiral Bill McRaven this morning on TV, who was talking about, and those of you who don't know who McRaven is, he's the guy who got bin Laden. He's the guy who directed the operation that took out Osama bin Laden. And so he's been around and has earned his chops. And he said, the most important thing we need to think about are asking ourselves, who are we? I mean, who are we? And how do we take who we are and translate it into things that matter for everybody else? And that's a pretty good question. And that question is not going to go away. It's always been there, and it's on the table now in front of us. And in a way, looking for a refuge from that question is separating yourself from the great opportunity to have impact. So it means sometimes you're going to get maybe a little bit beaten up and bloodied, but boy, all I can say is that from my point of view, that's the fight I want to be in, because I still believe that there's a chance to be able to get at some of this stuff. TJ, a question for you that's coming here, and a reminder that for those of you in the audience, please toss your questions into the Q&A box. We've got lots of good questions, and we'll keep going at it. We've got a lot of really interesting stuff to be able to talk about, but please keep those questions coming just in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. This is from an anonymous an attendee saying, I'm about to start a dual degree program, MPP and a PhD in psych. I'm hopeful that by the time I'm ready to go in the job market, things will have stabilized a lot. But I also want to be intentional from the start with my preparation. If you were starting a PhD in today's market and climate, what would you do differently or the same, knowing what you know now? Or is that a good question?
Yeah, and I think the response is going to depend very much on kind of what areas we're in. So I'd say for mine, I'm an economist, and that one, I think that's a career path that embodies, I think, some of the advice we're giving about maybe transferable skills and not being locked into one particular area. There's a lot of stuff you can do with that particular training. I mean, I had no intention of actually being in academia when I started that, but there's a lot of easy pivots from there because the core skill set is really in high demand. And that, I think, is what you could take you're looking at MPP and psych, and I think that's a combination that complements each other in terms of a diversity of skills. But even within that, I'd really lean into what sort of skills are broadly transferable. Like I'd focus on trying to avoid being overly specialized, I think is a trap we can fall into. And not to say there aren't benefits from specialization, but in terms of vulnerability to change, either in, say, the government's priorities or longer term stuff, like Don was talking about, preparing for a future that looks very much unlike, what we've encountered so far, and focusing on things like competencies versus real task orientation, not being I can do these particular functions really well that may change, but I'm an effective decision maker. I use evidence really well. I work well with data, these sort of general things that aren't going to really pigeonhole you into a really specific spot. I mean, I think there's elements where you want to try and anticipate things. So, say, trying to cultivate skills that are complementary to AI rather than, say, in competition. There's kind of more granular stuff you can do, but big picture, I would really encourage you to be as much as you can looking forward to a lot of different options that all play nicely with the skill set you're developing, rather than having a really narrow path set up for yourself.
Kosali, you're a bridge builder, and both in terms of what your administrative job is, but also in terms of the kind of work that you do. And what's your thought on this?
I think that keeping a positive outlook on the fact that there are so many ways in which your skills are going to be needed, and you're just going to have to think of preparing yourself under trying circumstances of greater uncertainty, yet there is going to be skill building you're developing because you're going to be part of solving so many problems that we do not yet know, or opportunities that exist. So thinking about these transferable long run skills at the same time, trying to stay really up on top of what is happening in so many innovations related to AI. TJ, you brought up AI and jobs. Even if we weren't talking about public sector, public service jobs, even if we weren't talking about how has the change in the downsizing of federal government and state governments affecting jobs, we would be here today talking about the fast pace at which everybody's job is going to be affected, or put another way, the way we go about doing whatever we want to have impact is being changed by technological change. I won't, even if we weren't going to use the word AI, we would be saying technological change is at a pace of change that is unprecedented. And while it's been something that we've all adapted to throughout history, technology has changed. I think it's just a stunning rate of change. And that itself introduces a lot of uncertainty, and trying to understand, trying to really stay up on top of what is the way in which somebody who is doing the work I plan to do or am doing right now, it's changing. So viewing AI from so many different angles, that's going to make you, that seems like a set of, go make sure we're on top, we understand how all that's going to affect, and what the skill sets are, as you said, DJ, again, complementary skill sets, the way we're going to use these as a tool for us rather than a replacement for us.
Yeah, and I think part of what I hear you saying, Kosali, is that we need to make sure, in a sense, that we're working on the right questions, and that we're keeping our radar tuned to the questions that are emerging and that are ahead of us. Because one of the things that too often happens, and it's a special trap for doctoral students, I think, is developing hypotheses for dissertations and therefore for research careers that are based on driving 60 miles an hour down the road by looking in the rearview mirror. That is, by going back at looking at all the articles that have been published on something and finding a way to try to advance something that happened 10 years ago in some kind of incremental way. And that's a trap to boredom on the one side and to paralyzing your career on the other. That I think, Kosali, your advice about keeping up to date on what it is that really needs the most attention and the kind of stuff that needs, the most focus. The idea of an MPP and psych You just think about the questions of organizational behavior and in terms of motivation and in terms of finding ways of building a workforce that works across the kind of boundaries that you've got. I mean, God, wow. I mean, that's big and important stuff. And the other piece of advice, and I think TJ, you were talking about this as well, is making sure that you focus on broad competencies as opposed to narrow deep dives. There's a real risk, I think, in thinking that what we're going to do in public policy is we're going to really learn as much as we possibly can about something so that we can be an expert and go and interview and say, here's what it is that you ought to do in climate change, or here's what you ought to do in water policy. And with the rise, especially of AI, that's a really bad idea these days, because I have one of my favorite AI engines, and I could probably spend 10 minutes on it and have an outline of the most cutting edge issues that you need to do in a particular issue without having taken 5 courses in it. And people who take 5 courses are going to know maybe a lot, but maybe not on the margin enough that really matters. So it's the broad competencies that really matter. I love every once in a while telling dinosaur stories from back in the early days of my own career. But believe it or not, when I was a mere pup and a graduate student, we did, of course, statistical analysis, which consisted of typing our data and commands on IBM cards, which I know for almost everybody here is people have no idea what I'm talking about. But they were cards of about this size that you had to sit there, and they punched holes in the card that represented your data. And you would have a deck maybe of it was a sophisticated job of 500 or 600 cards that you'd have to put in. And we would, because we were mere grad students, we had the lowest possible priority in having our jobs run. And so again, this seem like nonsense for those of you interested in who've done SPSS on a computer or even a laptop and get the results back like that. But we would submit a job, and the room that we were sitting in was super hot, but the room where the computer was, which was the size of most people's living rooms, was super air conditioned, because we would not want the computer to get hot, and because it did get very hot running and stuff. So we'd find out maybe 20 or 25 minutes later that we had made a mistake in punching a card at number 235 that we'd have to go back and correct, and then so resubmit the job and do it all over again. And sometimes it would take you all afternoon just to run a job and get a statistical result that came out. And so that the pace of change from there to what happened even by the time I graduated from graduate school, where we had actual tape where we were able to collect our data, to where it is we are now with my iPhone, which is more powerful than the computer that put a man on the moon, is stunning. So that the idea of figuring out that what I'm going to do is base my career on just learning a lot and just diving really deep on what it is that we can know now is crazy, because you're going to miss all the fun. Instead, what TJ says, I think, is focusing on the basic competencies that you can bring and figuring out then how to try to apply them to what Kosali's talking about, which is figuring out how to stay on top of the issues so that you can jump on the stuff that really matters. So I think a pair of good pieces of advice there. We have Alfredo, who has just finished teaching a class in administration, public and nonprofit organizations at George Mason. 27 master's students who work one way or another for the federal government. And they're dealing with the old politics and administration dichotomy, and dealing with issues having to deal with helping public administrators deal with disagreements with elected and appointed officials over them. Oh golly gee, that hot issue now. It was a hot issue for the ancient Romans too, by the way. In our assessment, and this is a question for each of you I want to try to ask you to turn to, are we adequately preparing our next generation of administrators to deal with the political administration dichotomy conundrums they are seeing today? How might we buttress our instruction curriculum to better outfit them for success in this environment? And let me just say it's a hot issue now, but it ain't nothing new, that's for sure. For those of you interested in trying to poke around this, there's a great book by Hugh Hecklow written about 50 years ago called A Government of Strangers that looks at exactly that issue as well too on top of that. So it's just fascinating because the issue is eternal. So let me ask each of you to turn to this. Dan, look at you first.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, there's a couple of things that have come up that I think are really important. And you're right, not just in this environment, they've been important for a long time, but that I don't know that we always do well with our students. And I mean, I think one is very like rigorous, at least in our program. There's a lot of ethics content, but it's sort of sprinkled throughout the program in different places. And I don't know that we always train students well on what to do in those like very difficult ethical situations. I mean, like we're seeing public administrators, senior executive service folks in the federal government having to deal with now. Um, Clearly, at a lot of levels, you might not have, a lot of public servants are probably in their career not going to face the question of, do I do this or do I resign? But there's lots of, different um, ethical conundrums that come up at all levels of government. So I think really preparing students well for that is clearly very important. And again, it's not like it's something that public administration certainly ignores, and I'm sure some programs have more content, more emphasis than others. But speaking for mine, I think probably a more focused attention to that is important. But I will say I'm not, so my background is not actually trained in public administration, but in political science. And I do think that as I teach my public policy undergrads, they don't always think about politics. Like going back to this question earlier of public managers and can you sort of be in a position where you can stay away from the politics part? I mean, I agree. No, like you're in a political environment as an actor. And so it's really important to understand that environment. And I think in the policy space, one of the things I talk about with my students a lot is even if you're doing policy research and you're approaching it ethically, an objective researcher, you're going to put research out there in the world and then it's going to be used politically. Like people are going to talk about it, people are going to use pieces of it that you're going to say, well, that's not what I said, right? And you have to be prepared for that. And I try to prepare my students for that. And also prepare them for I used to work at an inspector general's office and in Health and Human Services, and they had been essentially writing the same report on the same kind of wasteful spending algorithm that Medicare had for prescription drugs for like 15 years, right? Doing the same, focusing on different drugs, coming to the same conclusion, though, writing the same report, doing the congressional hearings. And it wasn't until the Affordable Care Act came up and there was this policy window that all that stuff kind of got vacuumed up and put into a bill and was able to affect change. But I think that's something that can discourage folks working in a policy space when you're doing good work and it's not necessarily having an immediate impact. So I guess that all comes back around to this point, I think, of preparing our students for operating in a political environment, even as objective, professional actors.
No, that's a great point. I used to torture my students with a case study that was a kind of benefit cost analysis, and it was a public works case about whether or not to make an investment or whether to rely on manpower. And so I would give the case to the students, and it turned out that everything about the way that the case turned out had to do with the assumptions that they made at the beginning. And so that the students, without knowing it, would go down one road or another, having implicitly brought values into the case in a way that dictated everything that followed afterwards. So that you think that you can somehow make analysis that's non-political. They used to hate me for it. They got so mad at me because it was a kind of a gotcha situation, but they never forgot the lesson of exactly what you're saying there, Dan, that there's no escaping the politics, and the key is discovering how to bring your expertise and capacity to bear in an environment that's inevitably political. TJ, let me ask you your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'd say, I mean, I think I get a different take just as an economist. I think the contribution of economic thinking to this area within the policy training space, I'd say is especially deficient in this area in terms of preparing people to navigate these sort of the political administrative sort of realities, as Alfredo put it. I think we get so focused on sort of apolitical should questions, which is red element, right? What's the optimal thing to do, right? What would in fact be, the best interest of the decision makers we represent? And that's certainly a key piece, but I think we end up inadvertently cultivating this belief that those sorts of roles exist where that's all you actually deal with. That even if your value added is in some competencies around, say, providing the evidence and making sense of the evidence, that you're going to be navigating an environment that isn't just this sort of benevolent, relentless optimizing machine as a government. I think there's been a lot of change within economics at the level of individual decision makers. I think sort of behavioral science revolution has changed the way we look at how people make choices, but I don't think that's carried over enough the way we look at collective choice or government choice. I mean, we have political economy, so it's not as if this is unheard of within economics, but I feel like that's too much separated out. We treat that as this modular thing that doesn't really have to pervade the thinking of the rest of our disciplines, that we can just sort of settle for we're just the data people, we're answering the technical questions, we do the quantitative analysis stuff, and we'll leave the rest to everybody else. And even if that's where we're contributing, I think we're leaving people ill-equipped to operate successfully in that environment. And so I think that is one of those big competencies where I think my discipline in particular is falling short.
Yeah, and it's kind of, and I want to spend some more time talking in detail about curriculum issues in just a little while. But one of the things, TJ, to emphasize your point is that if you go back to the launch of the Affordable Care Act and what happens if you turn basic questions about designing the website over to people who have very narrow visions about how it ought to work, and gee, what could possibly go wrong when it turns out that only 8 people can sign up the first day? And it's the failure of trying to find ways of reaching across with the kind of competencies that are required, and not only failing to engage the political questions, but creating political problems by failing to try to do the kind of stuff that we're talking about here. And that's if there ever was a case and a need for really top-notch policy analysts to try to figure out the politics of situations by figuring out how to serve people, it was that. And it's the great lesson of thinking in too narrow cubby holes, I think. Kosali?
I was thinking about how just in my own teaching, how I'm an economist trained to teach out of a textbook in a very traditional way. And I found, of course, that instead what I found much more engaging with students to do is to think of the settings in which you will be using these tools. So I try definitely to think about economics will give you the tools to answer these questions, and then how do we teach skills of answering with evidence questions that are asked. So that too is constantly evolving in how I started teaching how to use information to answer questions, to now even I just recently, a couple of classes ago, had to tell students I am going to scrap what I did even in preparing for the class in December, and I had to redo that lecture because of just how different it is the way we will learn R and Python, for example. So that I'd have tutorials on here's how we're going to learn it. And now I've said, no, that scrap all that I told you. Instead, let's just go use ChatGPT to guide us through this, use all these other Google Colab or various tools. And I said, this is likely the way you're going to learn, but even more so, you're going to learn that it's okay to scrap what you thought and say, we're just doing it differently. But the principles are the same, right? So my first introduction to thinking, here's the setting. I might just draw some figures and say, here's the room in which your team will be meeting to answer this kind of a question. And here's what's going to go into it. You're going to have this analysis part. You're going to have these questions. All that is still the same. It's just and how is that really going to happen? How's the way in which you're going to use tools to do that? but having people think, the fundamental questions still remain the same. Human behavior still is the same. So it is very important to think about, for example, learning project management. Those might be things. There's now much more formalized training in, right? We always knew that was important, but I don't think there existed this breadth of the ways in which you could become skilled in project management that is formalized, for example, or to think about understand all the conflict resolution training that there exists. That again was not formalized before. So think of it as what we want to prepare our students for is taking the best of what we've been trained in our traditional original training, but incorporate it into here's the way in which work actually happens now, and put it into more real world settings when teaching it.
Yeah, great stuff. And I want to poke around some of these questions some more, but I thought I heard you use the dreaded word chat GPT. That is, you actually encourage your students to use it?
They do, because I'm influenced here by having asked employers what you are doing, or just reading magazines of employers or surveys of employers in which it's seeing quotes of your job is going to depend on how well you use AI, not that you're going to refuse to use it, right? And saying, I'll give an example. For example, I tell my students whenever I have changed something in the class, how I use ChatGPT to do it. I might have said, these few slides that you're about to see show you what it used to be like. It was like this. And I really didn't think that was the best way to explain it, but I hadn't put a lot of thought into it. And I recently asked one of the LLMs, give me some ideas of how to make students more engaged in whatever that topic is. And I say, here are some ideas. I decided not to use this one, but I used this one. And that I'm going to make sure if I use any of it in a report, for example, that I'm going to have a disclaimer at the bottom, because I don't want to be afterwards asked, did I use it? And I say, oh, I did. And so I'm just going to say in a footnote or something I used, but we should be doing that with anything else we do. For example, we'd often in papers say, if you ask somebody to give you tips on writing in your paper, even if you did it as a paid service, it's good to have acknowledged that you used somebody to read proofreading assistance was provided by. So it's the same. We just want to have it acknowledged.
Yeah, and there's another thing. The question about how to teach some of the stuff is also more broadly an important thing to try to look at as well. I did a similar thing, but in a different kind of way, where I talked to about 5 senior feds, and I said, "What is it? Can you give me some examples of some things that you really need to get done? Skills that students would be, boy, you would love to have people know how to do." And one very, very senior person said, "You know what? We get a spreadsheet with thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of lines, one for each of our employees, on the Federal Employment Viewpoint Survey, which measures their level of engagement. And you know what I would really love, what I really, really need, but don't have time to do myself, but would be hugely helpful in trying to manage my agency." And because this was an agency manager, and the person said, "Here, tell me what this means." So something that involves only an analysis of Excel, but provides a manager of an agency with the tools needed to try to figure out how to engage better with their employees. And that's a pretty good skill, but it's not necessarily one that we always teach either on top of that. And it's one that wouldn't take that long to teach, but figuring out how to teach it and what to do with it is incredibly valuable. And I get people telling me all the time that, wow, I just wish we had people we could hire who could do that. And so that's the kind of thing, which actually gets back to the psychology, organizational psychology and MPP question that we had a little bit earlier too on top of that. Really interesting stuff. Dash has got a question here. It says, "I'm going to be graduating with an MSW and MPP from Rutgers next month. What would you consider, where would you consider looking for jobs based on the current political climate that one might not otherwise consider?" So sort of has an idea what to do, but what other doors would it be useful to try to kick open? Thoughts about that one? Kosali, let me start coming back around to you on that one.
Sorry, yes. So I think about how many of the skills that you might be using, eventually wanting to use, let's say in state government or federal government, you might be finding that similar skills are going to be useful when you're looking at, let's say, regulatory affairs jobs within the private sector or public relations within nonprofits. You might look at jobs that are about corporate social responsibility. So those are many options where you look, and also right now there are many ways in which your AI is going to help you uncover the job options of what you're looking for. So if you are able to describe more conceptually, I want to be able to help in decisions that weigh to uh, how to help an organization with uncover the ways to get through regulatory steps, for example, or through administrative rules, then you might be led to a job within, let's say, a private sector position, but one in which that experience is going to be really helpful in then going later to a public sector job.
Yeah. Dan, I saw you nodding your head too.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think certainly look in all the normal places that you would, including government, nonprofit, even with the environment. But I also thought of I know my students in particular don't always think about the public or the private sector and businesses. There's a little bit of a sometimes, especially the ones that are really committed to public service. There's sometimes a bit of a ooh, corporations kind of feel to the students. But I've talked to them about, like, I have a good friend who works in the policy. One of the policy offices at Amazon. Like a lot of companies have regulatory affairs or even public policy offices. Of course, some of those are advocacy oriented. Others are figuring out how to deal with government regulations. So you sort of figure out what is the mission of the office, and is that where you want to be? But that can be they value these types of skills that students from MPP programs, MPA programs have, and the experience and understanding of government that, like, say, an MBA student may not have. And the other thing I'll say is, and this is a point that Kosali also made, is, like, this isn't forever, right? So these are, even if you want to go into public service, but aren't able to enter public service right away, working at some of these private sector firms in these offices will help you build other skills, network, make other connections that then you can potentially move into a public sector position. So, I often try to tell my students, especially the ones who are graduating, that first job feels like a big deal. I got to get the right first job. I'm like, well, careers are very windy things. Like mine was, I ended up in jobs I never expected. That's the case for most people. And that's okay. So, I think it's about expanding your horizons. But part of that is also understanding what value you bring, and that is an exercise that the student has to do. Like, transferable skills, the term has come up a lot, and we as faculty, I think, are very familiar with that term now, but sometimes students aren't, and they have to really inventory what are those skills, what are those experiences they've had, and how does that translate into different types of jobs and positions and the needs for those jobs. So that is a place where, like, career services at your institution, et cetera, can often help you think about how do those experiences you had translate. I actually find that the most with the doctoral students, because you're on this track, especially if you're on the academic track, like, I'm publishing, I'm teaching, I'm going to become a professor, and then, well, maybe not right away. And then it's hard for students to step back and think about, like, I did a whole dissertation project, I'm a project manager. Or maybe I had some undergraduate RAs help me with my dissertation. I've done now management. Like, I've managed a group of students, or I've had to do the interpersonal relations. But you have to really step back and inventory that. So I think that's really valuable too.
So the two sides of this coin, one is understanding not so much what you know, but what you can bring. That's not so much what you know, but what you can do. And then the other half of it is that there. This may be good advice for a lot of people, but it never was for me. I mean, develop a 5-year, 10-year plan for your career. I mean, my plan never survived its first encounter with the enemy. I mean, it just was, I never, ever, ever possibly would have imagined that when I graduated with a PhD, that I ended up doing what I'm doing now. And the same is true for a lot of people that I know who work for government as well. They take what they know how to do and the impact that they can have, and they find ways of being able to apply it. And that's where the real, in my experience, at least talking to students, that's where the real excitement comes from. It's not from learning more and more and more about something. It's being able to do more and more about stuff that matters. And that's pretty cool. And that's where it is that I think we have such a great advantage in our field. TJ, don't want to leave you out on this question because I think it's such an interesting one.
Yeah, I think a lot of it, I think, depends on your expectations in terms of what you wouldn't be considering. So I think to Dan's point, a lot of people go into an MPP program thinking, public sector, with public's right in the name, but at USC, we have about an even split between private, public, and nonprofit in terms of where people place. The federal side, partly this is being in California rather than farther east, relatively small share of that is federal. So I think a lot of the traditional places are still there. So I wouldn't think that everything has been turned upside down. We have to abandon all of your plans, but kind of around the margins, I might think about, I think oftentimes people get stuck in how they want to do something rather than what it is they really want to do. And so if the idea is I want to serve the public, there are ways to do that that don't involve public service in the sense of going and being a federal employee. And I think broadening out maybe even what sort of employers you might be interested in, just the fact that, say, an employer doesn't do at its sort of big picture level exactly what it is you want to do, that doesn't mean there aren't opportunities to add value within an organization like that that are advancing the things you actually care about. And so I think that ends up being kind of ties together some of these other answers as well, is what is it that you add value in, right? What are the say competencies that you bring or the skills that you can bring that are valued in other settings, and finding maybe more creative ways to do something that you feel good about and that is actually going to be valuable, but maybe not in exactly the way that you would anticipate it there. So I think a lot of those opportunities I would tend to agree are going to be private sector. I also think longer term, I would expect foundations to start playing a bigger role. I do think that while there will probably be a pretty good sized rebound in some of these federal roles, I think some of this might change as we see that maybe some of the things that we just take as a given historically, this is just the domain of the federal government. I think there may be opportunities popping up, whether that's private and their philanthropic side, whether that's foundations, whether it's NGOs, seeing that there may be roles to fill there. So I could see an expansion in other ways of doing things that you might have planned to do as a public sector employee.
Uh, that's really, I think, really interesting stuff. And uh, there's something actually, if you push this a little far, pretty revolutionary about this. I'm uh, pretty, and even incendiary about this because I've talked to a lot of incoming students who say, what I really want is I want to do environmental policy. I want to do health policy. I want to do transportation policy. And what they view this as is a way to, I'm going to come and spend 2 years learning as much as I possibly can about the particular topic, because by learning it, I'm going to learn how to do it. And that strikes me just to be a dangerous thing in general, but especially dangerous in this environment, because the more that you pigeonhole yourself, the more that you don't follow what it is that all of you have been saying, but Kosali in particular has been talking about. I think that there's a risk in that. And what I want to try to do with the few minutes we have left is, first of all, I have a top 5 list of things that people ought to think about that maybe they haven't thought about as possible career things, but then ask everybody kind of pointed questions about if it turns out that we can't go back to where we were at the end of 2024, maybe we shouldn't take our curriculum back to the end of 2024 either. On top of that, what should we do to our in a kind of blue sky version of our curriculum to try to do all the brilliant stuff that we've been talking about for the last hour and a half. And first, just for fun, my top 5 list. One is that there's a lot of focus on trying to deal with waste, fraud, and abuse in government. When was the last time you had even a halfway serious conversation about exactly how to get at that? And there are hundreds of billions of dollars, it is said, in improper payments in Medicare and Medicaid. Well, some of that has to do with the fact that some governments have not done a very good job in overseeing their contractors and actually being able to document what they've done. And in some cases, there are people out there trying to steal the government blind. Suppose that you said, you know what, you go to Uncle Elon and you say that I'm going to help you find waste, fraud, and abuse, which you haven't done a very good job on so far. Here's what it is that I can do for you. You know, you take AI and you take some other applications in budgeting and in public finance, and in contract management, and it turns out that you can actually learn some stuff about how to do. You can actually do some of it instead of having people talk about it, because as we all know, just slashing government employees because they're the easiest target doesn't get you very far in the waste, fraud, and abuse front. So that's the first thing. Think about here's what I could do about that. Second thing. Just one word, Medicaid. If you want to understand the way in which half the babies in the country are born, if you want to understand what pays for 2/3 of all the beds in nursing homes, if you want to understand the single biggest and fastest growing item in state government budgets, if you want to understand a big target that the Republicans have to pay for tax cuts, the answer to all those things is Medicaid. And Medicaid is the program that almost nobody really understands well, but which is responsible for a lot of the things that a lot of us really care about. And so there's so many opportunities to engage that program in ways that help provide better care for people and find ways of making sure we spend our money well. You just understanding the skills that it takes to be able just to dive into some of the stuff that I just mentioned. There's huge stuff there. Third, drinking water. Drinking water is good. People expect drinking water that is plentiful and clean. And it turns out that increasingly, even in places that seem to have lots of water around, it's a harder and harder problem to deal with. And it turns out to be deceptively difficult sometimes to manage in terms of just operating the treatment plants that are responsible for that. Whether you're living like where TJ is, where drinking water is really tough, but in other parts of the country as well, where people are struggling. Just in terms of local public works, there are real skills in trying to manage the systems that are responsible for that. In Austin here, we had to boil water for 4 days, and it turned out that the reason was that somebody screwed up the human relations, the HR and personnel component of the Public Works Department in charge of water. It turned out to be a public administration question that caused everybody in the 10th largest city in the country to have to boil water for 4 days just because they didn't know how to do their HR. Fourth point, paying for what we want. Budgets matter. Financial management matters. If you grab them by their budgets, their hearts and minds will follow, and understanding how it is that you can both deal with the public values that shape the way in which we spend our money and tracking where the money goes. That is an issue that has never, ever gone away. And anybody who graduates from any of our programs without knowing how to try to at least understand those pieces is doing their career a huge disservice. And anybody, on the other hand, knows how to do that will always be able to find a way to get a job. And then finally, the last point is, and this is something that we've touched on in so many different ways throughout the course of our conversation here today, but it's the role of the private and nonprofit sectors in producing public value. Because it's increasingly impossible to separate the jobs that are truly public from the jobs that are private, whether it's producing airplanes that fly us around the country, or whether it's producing the water that I was just talking about, or Medicare or Medicaid. It turns out that the people who are in charge of Medicare and Medicaid are really private contractors who manage most of the payment systems out there, and that government has a huge problem in leveraging that. We have such interpenetration of public and private sectors that if you're interested in achieving the public interest, you need to understand on the one side how the private sector is responsible for producing it, and then on the other side how the public sector can manage the private sector's pursuit of what is the public wants. Those are all big things to talk about, and their dissertation topics in each of those things too, on top of that as well. So this is pretty cool stuff, I think. So for those of you trying to figure out, what am I going to do? My career is at an end. I mean, for heaven's sakes, I mean, we got to get ourselves in gear, because this is stuff we need to work on for sure. Let me ask each of you in turn. Suppose that you were to be the curriculum god from the sky, and coming in raining fire and brimstone down on somebody else's program, not your own. And what is it that you would tell people that they really need to do to try to retool what they teach, to be able to make sure that students have a chance to be able to learn? And so, no particular order other than the fact that's the way it appears on my screen. Dan, let me start with you.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. It's a big question. I mean, again, it's not that we don't necessarily teach these, but we've talked a lot about transferable skills. We've talked about the need to, one thing I wrote down, where I think it was Don, you were talking earlier about agencies, that you talked to an agency and they said the thing, we have the viewpoint survey, but what does it mean? So there's meaning making and storytelling from data that is really necessary. We've talked in this conversation about AI and emergent technology that's going to reshape what we do. And even the 5 things that you went over, things like fraud, waste, and abuse, budgets, being able to understand budgets, budgeting process, etc. There's a lot of analytical skills that are necessary for all of that, right? Like traditional policy analysis and stats and things like that I always encourage students to kind of to skill up, right? To have those skills that can, again, be used in a variety of questions. Like knowing research methods and statistics is valuable, whether you're trying to specialize in environmental policy or cannabis policy, which is my area, or energy policy, or social work, social policy, things like that. But I do think that one thing that we don't always do well, and I teach a stats class, so I can say this and critique myself, is that meaning making part, right? Like, what does all this mean, and how do I use these analytical skills to, diagnose and solve, or try to solve a problem or find solutions to a problem, but then more importantly, communicate that in an effective way to other people. I don't know that we do that part always particularly well. Like we teach a lot of the skills, but then the bigger picture, pulling those skills together and helping our students understand how to be good storytellers and meaning makers, I think is the thing that I would want to grow, especially in like an MPP program where they are trying to go out and change policy and operate in a political environment.
Yeah, that's right. Because OMB's actually been working on that, and GAO's been working on that, and federal agencies have been trying to do that. And as we said earlier, you have the choice of either you're telling the story or allowing somebody else to. And boy, I would always rather being in a position to tell the story about the data that I'm producing. So great point there, Dan. TJ.
Actually, I have very similar thoughts. And so maybe to add some specificity, I think where we tend to fall down is not just a lack of training in communicating sort of the so what, but who we're communicating that to. I feel like so much the way we set up a lot of our training is to communicate to someone with at least as much expertise. But if we're training, say, an MPP and doing, econometric analysis or something like that, I am not the target audience, right? The target audience is someone who doesn't know the vast majority of the terms they're going to use. If they're speaking to a peer, they don't want to see the technical, gory details behind the scenes. They don't have a basic idea of like, what do I need to believe to trust what you're doing, and what do I make of this? And so I think there's oftentimes an overemphasis on the really technically rigorous version and not enough on the communicating this in a way that is useful. I think we tend to overemphasize being right and not being useful or effective in actually doing this with a purpose. And I think that permeates a lot of what we do. But certainly, much like Dan, I teach entirely technical skill stuff. And I think that is how I've seen my own teaching evolve the most throughout my career is not just how do you do this, but why are we doing this and how do you help somebody who doesn't know the answer to those questions make sense of this and have this actually be helpful.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Kosali, your thought on this?
I think many of these factors programs are already thinking, because I think our master's programs especially have been very evolving and innovative in trying to address these issues of let's see what the real world job actually looks like. But just to add a few more things, I think of it as, is there a hidden curriculum in the graduate education, in the master's education in particular, of things that we want to ask our alums, what would you have wanted to know more of? And keep incorporating that, because the alums that we would have asked 2 years ago will say different things than the alums we're going to ask today, right? So I think having curriculum design incorporate more of the alumni voice is as a continuous measure of evolving. And then for me, teaching also technical skills, I try every day in class to think about what would the water cooler version of what you're learning be. Let's try and, even in a small amount of time, think about an example of a setting in work in which there would be a discussion on something where you're going to bring in the skill of what you just learned, these concepts of elasticity of demand, of whatever. Where would it be in a more practical sense? And if I can get to the point that I can have my students walk away thinking, okay, I know I learned that, here's where I would use it, I think that I would feel like the good class.
And is a great series of points, because what the main lessons that I'm drawing from all this is to make sure that you have your radar tuned to the outside, to make sure that you're listening to the right people to pick up the right pieces of advice, whether you're an international student trying to find ways of navigating what's going on, to what kinds of things really matter in terms of what you need to learn and teach, for that matter too. On top of that, it's a matter of understanding that there's no escape from politics, as nasty and difficult as the politics can be, unless you want to just opt yourself out of anything that really matters. But that the way to try to deal with that is to find ways of developing strategies of communication, whether it's storytelling or water cooler conversations, or even being able to do, in my case, tell my long-suffering spouse about what I'm working in without her falling hopelessly asleep in the middle of all the conversation about it. I'm just being able to explain to people why it is that what you do matters, and about how it is that you can create value for them. And I think that really is the piece. And so the question is, okay, well, I mean, why do I need to go to school for 2 years to learn that? Well, it's not a naturally occurring skill for a lot of people. And especially the value added that we bring has to do with being able to bring an extra level of sophistication and expertise and capacity and background and knowledge that the ordinary person on the other side of the water cooler doesn't necessarily have. You want to be able to create that aha moment on the point of the other person that then creates the reason why you're doing what you're doing. So I want to really thank first APPAM and Tara for organizing this session. Thanks so much to Dan and TJ and Kosali for what has been a great conversation. Thanks to all of you in the audience who have been joining us for this hour and a half, and for your great questions, and for your sticking with us for this long but really an important conversation. And most importantly, to wish all of you really the very best of luck, because our future really depends on your ability to be able to bring your skills and leadership to the big questions that we face. So thank you so much to all of you, and hope you have both a great rest of your day, but a super productive career in doing the stuff that we know has got to get done. Thanks again.
Thank you. Thank you, Don.
Bye-bye now.
Bye.